I've always known that ambition could be a double-edged sword. It cuts sharp and true when wielded with care, carving pathways into the unknown. But when you lose control, when you swing it wildly, blinded by the desire to make your mark, it can slice into the very fabric of what you hold dear. I wonder now if I ever truly understood the weight of the blade I'd been swinging. The Atlas Collider project was meant to be humanity's masterpiece, a bridge to the fundamental truths of existence. Orbiting Proxima Centauri, it stood as the pinnacle of our technological prowess. Kilometers of intricate superconducting loops, vast energy conduits siphoning power from nearby stars, all encased in an elegant lattice of interlocking panels that shimmered against the backdrop of deep space. We called it the Atlas because it bore the weight of our dreams, but as I stared at it from the observation deck, it looked more like a guillotine, poised and waiting. "Dr. Pierce, systems check is complete," came the clipped voice of Mason, one of our lead engineers. Efficient to a fault, he always had the air of a man who'd rather be anywhere else. "We're ready for final alignment." "Thank you, Mason," I replied. I knew I should feel exhilaration, pride even, standing on the precipice of a scientific revolution. Instead, I felt the same constant weight that had haunted me since the project began, a phantom pressure in my chest that no logic or data could dispel. The observation deck buzzed with activity. Everyone was so focused, so certain, so confident. Everyone but me. "Dr. Pierce." Mason again. I blinked, realizing I'd been lost in thought. "Final calibration requires your authorization." I nodded and approached the central console. The interface flashed as it recognized me, the system's voice confirming my identity. "Authorization granted. Begin alignment sequence," I said. As the Collider's systems activated, I glanced at my team. There was Alan, our quantum theorist, muttering to himself as his eyes darted over streams of data. Harlow, our communications specialist, sat rigidly upright. And then there was David, the experimental physicist who'd worked alongside me for over a decade. He caught my eye and gave a tight nod. David and I had always understood each other, even in silence. The room darkened as holograms dissolved into a single projection, a luminous model of the Collider now fully active. Lines of energy coursed through it like veins, converging toward the core where particles would collide at unimaginable speeds. "This is it," David said quietly, stepping beside me. "Years of work, Adrian. And now we're here." "Here," I repeated, staring at the projection. "Let's hope we survive it." He chuckled softly, though there was no humor in it. "You think we're pushing too far?" I didn't answer. What could I say? That I'd had dreams where the Collider tore open not just space-time, but something deeper, something I couldn't name. That I'd woken in cold sweats, haunted by visions of cascading stars collapsing into darkness. David was too pragmatic for that kind of talk. The countdown began, projected across every surface in sharp numbers. 5 minutes to history or catastrophe. "Power levels nominal," Mason reported, his voice tight with focus. "Core stability holding. No anomalies." "Particle streams aligned," added Alan. "Trajectory clean." The numbers ticked down. I gripped the edge of the console. Somewhere deep in the structure, magnetic fields stronger than anything Earth had ever produced were compressing particles to near light speed, coaxing them into trajectories that would culminate in a singular point of impact. The final 60 seconds began, and my mind wandered. To my daughter's face when she was 6, holding her first telescope. To my wife's tired eyes the last time we spoke. To the headlines that had called me a visionary, a genius, a pioneer. None of it mattered now. What mattered was the experiment, the proof, the truth that lay just beyond reach. The countdown hit 0. The Collider surged into a deafening crescendo, and then silence. For a second I thought the experiment had failed. But then I saw a shimmer in the air, like heat waves rising from asphalt. It grew, a distortion that absorbed light and space. The Collider's projection flickered and dissolved, replaced by raw data cascading across the room in bursts. The distortion flashed, and suddenly everything shifted. I felt a lurch in my gut, like the ground falling away beneath me. The observation deck warped, edges bending and twisting as though the laws of physics were unraveling. People shouted, consoles blinked out, and the lights dimmed to an eerie, fluctuating glow. And then the wave hit. It was like being submerged in freezing water, every nerve screaming in shock. I tried to move, to breathe, but time seemed to falter. My vision blurred, images doubling and tripling as if I were seeing through the eyes of a dozen versions of myself. I caught fleeting glimpses of my team, Harlow frozen mid-cry, Alan's hands reaching for something invisible, David staring at me, his expression one of utter disbelief. When I awoke, the first thing I noticed was the silence. Not the ordinary quiet of a sealed space station, but a profound stillness that stretched infinitely. I blinked, trying to orient myself, but the observation deck was gone. In its place was, I don't even know how to describe it. The ground was a shifting, translucent plane, glowing with fractal patterns. Above me stretched an endless void, punctuated by distant, flickering lights that felt more like eyes than stars. "David!" I called, my voice almost silent in the vastness. "Harlow! Mason!" No response, just the rhythmic flash of the fractals beneath me. I shuffled forward, my steps sending ripples through the ground. The collider hadn't just malfunctioned, it had done something worse. We weren't in Proxima Centauri's orbit anymore. Hell, we weren't anywhere real. Movement caught my eye and I turned sharply. There, in the distance, was a figure, silhouetted against the void. Hope surged through me as I staggered toward it, calling out again. But as I approached, I realized the figure wasn't moving. It wasn't human. It was a shape, angular and translucent, like a rough shard of frozen glass catching the light from above. Its edges fluctuated, as if struggling to maintain form, the fractal patterns within shifting and spiraling endlessly. I reached out hesitantly. The air around it felt dense, almost magnetic, drawing me closer with an invisible force. As my fingers brushed its surface, it reacted. Not with sound, but with a sudden, cascading ripple of light that fractured through its core. The ripple carried something with it, a flood of impressions that slammed into my mind. A civilization, vast and ancient, constructing the veil as a barrier, a fail-safe. Against what, I couldn't tell. But one thing was clear, we weren't supposed to be here. The realization struck with the force of a falling star. The experiment hadn't just gone wrong. It had ripped apart something fundamental and sacred. We had breached a boundary that should never have been crossed. And now, we were trapped in its aftermath. As the structure's light faded, I sank to my knees, unable to bear the crushing weight of what we had done. Somewhere in the distance, a faint vibration coursed through the ground beneath me, irregular and getting stronger, like the dissonant tremor of glass on the verge of shattering. I was still alone. My voice, when I called out for the others, barely carried, swallowed almost immediately by the stillness. There was no echo, no sign of life, nothing but the low sound of the fractals and the distant flashes of light above. My chest tightened with a desperate sense of isolation. But then, I heard something. A different sound, distant yet distinct. A voice, a call. I couldn't tell. I turned toward it instinctively, though there was no clear direction, just the amorphous shifting of the ground beneath me. I began to walk, my steps sending ripples through the translucent surface with each movement. The terrain began to change as I moved. What had been a smooth expanse of fractals became rough, uneven, the patterns breaking apart into chaotic shards. I stopped when I saw the first body. It was Mason, or at least it was something that looked like Mason. His form was frozen mid-motion, his face locked in an expression of terror, his body fractured, bending light into spectral streaks. His outline wavered, changing between solidity and translucence. I approached slowly. "Mason," I whispered. As I reached out, the distortion around his body intensified. My hand passed through him, and I felt a flash of fear, confusion, pain. But it wasn't my own. It was his. A fragment, left behind like an echo. I stumbled back, clutching my chest as his image shattered into 1,000 points of light, dissolving into the ground. I didn't know how long I stood there, shaken. Time didn't seem to move here, or perhaps it moved in ways I couldn't perceive. I kept walking, even though my legs felt like they were weighed down. Mason's fate haunted me, but it also sharpened my focus. If he'd been here, perhaps the others were too. Perhaps they were still alive. I found Alan next. He was crouched over a console that didn't exist, his fingers twitching in the air as though typing commands. His face was blank, his eyes unseeing. Unlike Mason, he didn't appear distorted, but there was a hollowness to him, an absence that was almost worse. When I approached, he didn't react. I knelt beside him, speaking his name softly, then louder, but he remained motionless. I touched his shoulder, and immediately the ground beneath us flared with light. Alan's head snapped up, his eyes locking onto mine with a sudden intensity that made me recoil. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice layered, overlapping itself. "None of us should." "Alan? What happened? Are you—" He cut me off, his voice rising. "It's broken. We broke it. The cascade. Do you even understand what you've done?" The fractal ground around him began to crack, fissures spreading outward, and I scrambled back. Alan's form wavered, his features shifting, morphing into something else. His voice became distorted, garbled, until it was nothing but static. And then, like Mason, he disintegrated, collapsing into a swirl of light and fractals. I was alone again, but not for long. I saw it. A presence. The flashing lights above intensified, descending closer. One of the lights broke away, spiraling toward me, getting larger, brighter, until it was all I could see. It wasn't a light. It was a form, angular and alien, changing constantly, as though refusing to settle on a single shape. It hovered before me, radiating an intelligence that was undeniable. I didn't know whether to run or to kneel. "You," it said, or rather, it communicated. The words were not spoken, but pressed into my mind. "You are the breach." "I don't understand," I stammered, though part of me already did. "We didn't mean to—" "You tore the veil. The cascade begins. Repair is required." The form fluctuated, its edges flaring and contracting. I felt its scrutiny, its judgment, and I realized with a sinking dread that this was no benevolent guide. It was a guardian, an enforcer, and it saw me as a threat. "Wait," I said, panic rising. "We can fix it. Tell me how." "There is no fixing," it replied, the words striking me like blows. "Only correction. You are the breach. You must be removed." The ground beneath me shifted violently. I was thrown backward, landing hard on the uneven surface. The Guardian advanced, its form getting larger and more menacing. I scrambled to my feet and ran. The ground buckled and twisted beneath me, fractals shattering and reforming with every step. The Guardian pursued, its presence crashing down on me. I didn't know where I was going. There was no direction, no escape, just the desperate hope that somewhere, somehow, I could find a way to stop this. I nearly collided with David. He appeared out of nowhere, standing amidst the chaos like a statue. Relief flooded through me, but it was short-lived. As I approached, I saw the flicker in his form, the distortion that marked him as not entirely real. "David!" I gasped, stopping short. "You're alive! We need to—" "Alive?" he interrupted, his voice colder than I'd ever heard it. "Is that what you call this?" I faltered, his words cutting deeper than the Guardian's had. He looked at me with anger and despair. "You don't understand, do you?" he said, stepping closer. "This isn't just about us. It's everything, every reality, every possibility. You didn't just break our universe. You broke all of them." "I'm trying to fix it," I said. "I didn't know—" "No, you didn't," he snapped. "You were so obsessed with your theories, your ambition, you didn't stop to think about what it could cost." "David, please." "It's too late. he said, his voice softening, though the bitterness remained. The veil is unraveling, and when it collapses, there'll be nothing left. No us, no them, just nothing. The Guardian was closing in. David glanced at it, then back at me, his expression hardening. There's one way to stop it, he said. The artifact. It's a failsafe, built by whoever created this place. But it's not a solution, it's a reset. It will erase everything from our timeline. The collider, the cascade, all of it. And us? I asked, though I already knew the answer. David didn't respond. The Guardian advanced, its light flaring. David stepped forward, placing himself between me and the Guardian. He turned to me one last time. Find the artifact, end this, before it's too late. The Guardian struck, its form enveloping David in a blinding flash of light. I shielded my eyes, but when the light faded, David was gone. I didn't have time to grieve. The ground beneath me was crumbling, fractals breaking apart into swirling voids. The Guardian turned its attention back to me, but I didn't wait for it to act. I ran, driven now not by fear, but by purpose. The artifact was out there, somewhere in this collapsing nightmare, and I was going to find it, no matter the cost. I didn't know how long I had been running. My legs ached, though I wasn't sure if I was running through fatigue or fear. The Guardian was tireless, a predator closing in. The fractal ground beneath me was splitting, shards of light and geometry dissolving into a nothingness that surged closer with every step. Ahead of me, a structure emerged from the shifting void. A monolithic obelisk carved from a black material that absorbed light. Its surface was adorned with ancient, flowing designs, resembling veins of molten gold weaving through dark stone. It radiated an ominous stillness, a sense of waiting, but the sight of it filled me with dread. This was the artifact David had spoken of, the failsafe left behind by the ancients who had created this realm. It was the key to undoing everything, and it would demand everything in return. I came to a stop, catching my breath as I reached its base. Up close, the artifact stood like a silent sentinel, its patterns shifting subtly. The gold veins gleamed like embers, and when I touched the surface, I felt a sudden wave of recognition. Not my own memories, but something deeper. I saw my daughter, 6 years old, proudly holding her first telescope. My wife, her smile warm before it faded into weariness. Mason, Alan, David, the faces of my team, suspended in moments of triumph and despair, etched into the patterns. This wasn't a machine. It was something older, more profound than I could comprehend. "You've reached the end," a voice echoed, and I turned sharply to see him. Another me, another Adrian Pierce. He stepped out from the shifting void, his face lined with exhaustion, but his eyes sharp, burning with something I couldn't quite name. He wasn't distorted like the others I had encountered. He was real, solid, and his presence chilled me to my core. "How many times do we have to do this?" he asked, his tone edged with bitterness. "How many versions of us need to destroy everything before one of us finally gets it right?" I stared at him, unable to speak. The Guardian had vanished, though I could still feel its presence in the distance. My other self stepped closer, gesturing towards the artifact. "You know what this is," he said. "You've seen what it can do. But do you understand what it means? Do you really understand what you're about to do?" "I'm trying to save—" I began, but he cut me off. "Save? Is that what you tell yourself? That this is salvation? You're not saving anyone, Adrian. You're erasing them, all of them, everything you've ever known, every choice you've ever made. It all disappears. And for what? So some other version of you can try again?" "I don't have a choice," I said. "The cascade—" "Don't talk to me about the cascade," he snapped. "I know what the cascade is, I know what it does, but don't pretend this is some noble sacrifice. This is survival, nothing more." I felt the ground shift beneath me, the fractals vibrating with an intensity that made my head spin. My other self shook his head, his expression softening. "You've made it farther than most," he said. "Farther than I did." "Why are you here?" I asked. He tilted his head, a sad smile playing on his lips. "Because you're not the first me to stand here, and you won't be the last." His words hit me. "You mean this has happened before?" "Over and over again," he said, his gaze distant. "Every time the collider activates, the cascade begins. Every time one of us stumbles into the veil, thinking we can fix it." He paused. "But the veil isn't a test. It's a trap. The ancients built it to contain the cascade, to force whoever caused it to make the ultimate sacrifice. And no matter what we choose, the same thing happens." I shook my head. "What do you mean? The cascade has to stop. If I destroy the timeline—" "Your timeline will be erased," he said bluntly, cutting me off. "Not just destroyed, forgotten. You, your daughter, your wife, everything you've ever been will cease to exist, and in its place another timeline will rise, one where the cascade never begins. But it won't be yours, Adrian. It'll be theirs." He gestured to the void, where fragments of other realities shimmered, like the dying embers of distant stars. For a long moment we stood in silence, the artifact behind us. I could feel it watching me, waiting. It wasn't sentient, at least not in the way we understood, but its presence was undeniable. It wanted an answer. It demanded one. "I don't have a choice," I said finally. "You know that." He sighed, his shoulders slumping. "I know. I just wish it didn't always have to be us." He took a step back, fading into the shifting darkness, and I felt the enormity of what I was about to do. There was no alternative. My timeline would be gone, erased as though it had never existed, and with it everyone I had ever known or loved. They would vanish into oblivion, and I would be left to carry the weight of their absence in a world that wasn't mine. I turned back to the artifact, reaching out to touch its surface. The patterns shifted beneath my fingers, flowing like liquid metal, and suddenly my mind was filled with visions. I saw my daughter, her face bright with joy as she pointed her telescope at the stars. I saw my wife, her smile fading as she sat alone in an empty room. I saw Mason, Alan, David, all of them, their lives intertwined with mine, their fates bound to the timeline I was about to erase. And then I saw the collapse. The cascade ripping through the fabric of reality, consuming everything in its path, leaving only darkness behind. The artifact pressed against my mind, urging me forward, and I felt its final demand. A choice. To act was to erase my timeline, to annihilate everything I had ever been. But to do nothing was to doom the multiverse to collapse. There was no middle ground, no compromise. Tears blurred my vision as I whispered their names. My daughter, my wife, my team. I whispered an apology, knowing they would never hear it. And then I made my choice. The artifact flared with a blinding light, and the veil around me began to dissolve. I felt it collapsing, reality unraveling as the cascade was contained. My body burned, my mind splintering under the weight of infinity. And for a brief, agonizing moment, I thought I could hear their voices, calling, pleading, fading. And then, darkness. When I awoke, the world was quiet. I lay on soft grass, the scent of earth and sunlight filling my lungs. I opened my eyes slowly, blinking against the brightness of the sky. It was blue, with wisps of clouds drifting lazily across it. The air was warm, gentle, and for a second I allowed myself to believe that I was home. But as I sat up, I knew the truth. The landscape was unfamiliar. Rolling hills stretched into the distance, dotted with trees that swayed in a soft breeze. There was no sign of the veil, no fractures in reality, no artifact. Just a world untouched by the cascade. I stood, my legs unsteady, and began to walk. The ground felt solid beneath my feet, real in a way that the veil had never been. But the weight in my chest hadn't lifted. My timeline was gone. My daughter, my wife, my team, they were gone. Everything I had sacrificed was lost, erased as though it had never been. And yet the multiverse was whole again. For them, for the others. In the distance, I saw a small house, its windows glowing softly with warm light. I hesitated, my heart pounding, but something pulled me forward. It looked familiar, though I couldn't say why. As I reached the door, it opened, and a young girl stepped out. She looked up at me, her eyes wide with curiosity, and for a moment my breath caught. She looked like my daughter, exactly like her. But there was something different, something I couldn't name. "Daddy?" she said, her voice tentative. I froze, my chest tightening. A woman appeared in the doorway behind her, my wife. She smiled at me, her expression warm, inviting. But her eyes didn't recognize me, not truly. They were kind but distant, as though she were looking at a stranger. "Come inside," she said gently. "You must be tired." I nodded, my throat tight, and stepped inside. The house was quiet, peaceful, filled with the warmth of a life I no longer recognized. As I sat down, she handed me a cup of tea, her smile unwavering. "Long day?" she asked, her tone casual, affectionate. I nodded again, unable to speak. The tea was warm, comforting, but it did nothing to soothe the ache inside me. Outside, the stars began to appear, their light steady and unbroken. I stared at them through the window, searching for something I couldn't name. Was this salvation, redemption, or just another fragile illusion, another borrowed life in a borrowed world? I didn't know, but for now it was enough to sit, to breathe, to exist.